on now?
Yeah, we can see it,
Thumbs up. Perfect. So that's that first slide covered. So yeah, today I just wanted to sort of do a bit of a run through through a number of areas, sort of some of the types of flood risk that we have in BCP in the Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council area, some of the responsibilities, a brief touch on the recent flood event in July last year, climate change and how that looks in our area, some of the works that we've got underway, both capital and sort of maintenance works, and also then looking at sort of understanding your own flood risk. I've put in a couple of drone images sort of throughout the presentation there. We've got 2 fully qualified drone pilots in the team, and actually it's something I love to see, just a sort of different perspective on life from what we quite often see on the ground. So always good with these two sort of looking at Christchurch Harbour area. Always stunning from the air. So as most of you all know, the sort of BCP Council area and be fairly familiar with it, but just sort of starting with that map, and thought it'd be useful sort of to go through some of the risks and responsibilities and who does what in the local area. As you will have known, it's 3 previous councils of Poole, Bournemouth and Christchurch joining together to form BCP. But actually what that meant is that there was previously 3 separate lead local flood authorities, as they're known, or 3 risk management authorities looking after flood risk in each separate council. But in joining those together, we formed one bigger flood and coastal risk management team, and actually have been able to attract a really good skill set within the area to look at flood risk. And actually it's been a really positive move from the flood risk management side, and actually in building the skills of the team and bringing people together to work collaboratively. As you'll notice when you sort of look around the BCP area, most of the actual area is surrounded by water. To the south, we've got the coast, we've got Poole and Christchurch Harbour and the open Poole Bay and Christchurch Bay. So we've got a coastal flood risk there. And to the north, you can see the River Stour sort of boundary, sort of at the boundary at the top side. And then sort of the Avon, the Mewden Viewer Brook and the Walkford Brook to the east. So there's a lot of water around in the BCP area on the boundaries, but perhaps not so much inside it. So actually that leads to a number of different flood risks in the area that we have. So on the coast, like I say, we have coastal flood risk from the open coast and from sort of still water levels within the harbour itself, as well as a coastal erosion risk. We've got main rivers that sort of flow through the Stour, the Avon, the Mew, the Bure Brook and the Walkford Brook, which are all in that sort of orange colour that you can see. And those would be looked after by the Environment Agency, who have permissive powers on sort of on main rivers. There's then a number of ordinary watercourses within the local area, some of the larger ones being the Kinson Stream, the Bourne Stream and the Blackwater Stream that you can see in the green. And those are some of the larger ones. I think, as Brian noted this morning, there's plenty more mapped and plenty of smaller watercourses throughout the entire area as well. We then have groundwater flood risk. It's not such a big risk for us as a council, but actually there are small pockets that are affected by groundwater, where some of the chalk strata allow sort of water to come up through the ground. So not so big, but still important. And surface water flood risk as well. And this is quite a big one for ourselves, and something that we take that we take on. And like I say, Chris Osborne sort of leading that inland flood risk team. And that can include sort of, it's a real mix of responsibilities. So there's ourselves sort of looking with water from the point where it falls as rainfall until where it perhaps hits a highway gully, which would then sort of sit with ourselves as the Highways Drainage Authority. And then sort of into Wessex water systems as well, and sort of into surface water and combined sewers. So Wessex water equally with a role to play. And particularly, as you can see there are large areas of BCP that don't actually have these kind of natural water courses running above the surface. So actually we rely quite heavily on those underground sort of network of pipes and drainage systems to ensure that water is drained effectively. So sort of one of the, just to sort of touch on, like I say, one of the larger events that we've had within the last year, and I'm sure sort of any resident of BCP would remember it, of July last year. We had a significant rainfall event over the Poole, sort of over the Hamworthy, Poole, Camford Heath, Creekmore areas. And on the left there, you can see an example of the weather warning that we received through from the Flood Forecasting Centre, what's known as the Flood Guidance Statement. And it really sort of just to highlight some of the challenges that we faced with in terms of surface water in particular, that actually with these warnings that we get through with coastal and with main river flooding, there's sort of flood warnings that can be issued. But actually in terms of surface water, it's so intense and so localised that it's actually quite difficult to offer those warnings in advance. And so we rely much heavier on weather warnings. But actually it's so localized. So you can see in the right hand picture there just how much rainfall fell from some of the gauges. The blue ones, some of the ones that are available via the Met Office World of Weather website, and the green ones, some of the ones that ourselves and the Environment Agency run. But you can see there sort of just how intense that band is around that sort of Hamworthy pool area, and that actually you only have to step slightly outside it to one side, and you can notice how the rainfall totals instantly half over that 4-hour period. And actually that has sort of a massive difference in terms of the areas affected and where that rain falls and how that looks. So I'm just going to move on here just to sort of pull up a graph to compare it to the airshow event in 2011 to give you a real sense as well as to how every rainfall event is very different and therefore has really different impacts. So the blue sort of bars there, time along the bottom and the rainfall up the side. So you can see how the blue one was this July 2021 event. And so actually we sort of had an intensity of around sort of 6 millimeters an hour maximum over every quarter of an hour, over that period. And over a much longer period. Whereas actually, if we look at the airshow events in the green bars there, you can see a much higher rainfall intensity in a much shorter time. And that one fell over the Bournemouth area. And it just sort of a reminder really that every event is different. Every event can fall in a slightly different location and therefore have different impacts on the ground. Here's just a sort of a montage of some of the issues that we faced and some of the issues that residents faced over that day. Unfortunately, being an urban event over sort of Poole, Hamworthy and Christchurch, we did sort of see quite a few. We had 41 properties recorded as flooding, which was sort of made up of 29 residential properties, 8 commercial properties and 4 schools. And actually sort of a real mix of impacts that actually we saw things like school pickups being impacted as well. So although the school shut, parents then had difficulties getting back to pick up the children due to sort of flooded roads. What I would also highlight as well, and really sort of to anyone listening, is really some of the risks of the flooding. And we saw that in speaking to some of the residents and some of the local people afterwards, that actually there is a risk to life in floodwater, and to actually encourage people to stay out of it at all times. There's also a real sort of public health issue as well, that actually we spoke with some people who'd become ill from actually sort of handling things that have been in floodwater, or from handling the floodwater itself and then not washing hands. And so actually sort of really encourage waterproof gloves, encourage people to wash hands, and also to encourage people not to walk in floodwater. That sort of top right hand picture there shows a manhole cover. You can see with sort of the water from it, but actually there's a high possibility, and it's very easy for water to actually float and lift manhole covers off and to move them away, and actually to have sort of submerged dangers or holes that you can't see. It only takes a small depth of water, particularly in a flood situation where it's often quite muddy and murky, to not be able to see your footing. So I'd really encourage people not to actually walk in floodwater during an event. On the right there as well, I've just taken a screenshot of the cover of what we call a Section 19 report. So under the Flood and Water Management Act, local authorities have a responsibility to investigate flooding, and under Section 19 of that report to actually then write a report and to put that into the public domain, to actually sort of looking at that flooding. So we've done that. We've completed that report and quite a thorough investigation, and we're due to publish that soon. So like I say, that will go into the publicly available sort of domain, and that will be available via our website. The other thing I wanted to sort of highlight as well is, being an urban area, as a council, we're sort of particularly vulnerable to climate change. I'm sure sort of many of you have seen that climate barcode effectively in the top right hand picture there, that takes sort of time on the bottom and actually does a sort of a stripe of the temperature of the year. And you can see sort of going back over 150 years just how the world is warming and how we're actually starting to see that sort of that change in temperatures in the world. And there's sort of numerous impacts that brings with it, and sort of implications in a flood risk context, in particular sort of warmer and wetter winters, hotter and drier summers, and also sea level rise and bringing it with it more intense and extreme sort of weather. So I've put in a few links there, and sort of throughout the presentation there's a few links, so hopefully if anyone's looking at it or afterwards, then you can sort of go in and look yourselves and actually find out a bit more information to make it easier. But something I sort of wanted to particularly highlight to people, I've used an acronym here, SCOPAC, so apologies for that. So it stands for Standing Conference on Problems Affecting the Coastline, and it brings together a number of local authorities across the whole of the South Coast. But they do a number of bits of research, and in particular this one that they did with the University of Southampton, they found a number of old tide gauge records. So the bottom right picture there is an example of the tide gauge records for Poole Harbour, and that's sort of going back over a number of years. They found sort of boxes and boxes of them, and so actually they've done a project to digitize those, to actually input them, and then to actually be able to start to analyze them. So that was going back to 1927, some of those records, which actually gives it one of the longer tide gauge records within the country. And again, I've given the web link there to the research itself, but actually by digitizing periods of that record, they've actually been able to show that in Poole Harbour itself, sort of locally, mean sea level rise rising at a rate of 2.2 millimeters per year, and actually extreme sea level rising at a rate of 3 millimeters per year. So I just thought it was really interesting that actually at a local context, we are starting to see some of those impacts as well, increasing sea level. And that also as well with sort of increased storms that bring sort of larger waves and larger storm surges as well. So actually in all that we're doing, having to account and design for those. And I've also just put in a screenshot here as well at the bottom of the flood risk assessment guidance. And that's sort of really what developers have to work to. But another example of how some of our main rivers, so thinking of things like the Dorset Stour here, for example, that comes all the way down from sort of Gillingham through Blandford and down towards Christchurch Harbour, how we're expecting and how the Environment Agency are expecting sort of levels in that river, sort of extreme levels in that river, to increase sort of as a central estimate by sort of 47% or sort of approximately 50%, so sort of 1.5 times current flows in an event, but actually could be as high as sort of double the flows, as up to 100% larger during events moving forward. So again, worth bearing in mind that actually we are starting to see some of those impacts, but we also are planning for them as all risk management authorities. So as I say, starting to plan for those risks. So actually, as BCP Council, like I say, we're very fortunate that we have got a very well-resourced team with a lot of skills actually, sort of since the merger 2 years ago, and we are starting to actually be able to take on more and more and look at projects in a good context and really look at them in a strategic context to take the best possible approach. So we've got a number of projects, and what we're actually trying to do is, like that top right-hand picture there, is we're not just trying to focus in on one small area and one location, but we're actually trying to look at the whole catchment. That we're actually trying to look at sort of right at the source as to where rainfall falls and what can be done there. We're looking at some of the pathways as to how water flows to where it sort of ends up, and then also looking at the sort of the issues at that flooding location. But hopefully by looking at it on this strategic approach, we can actually take find a better solution, and it could be a number of solutions as well throughout that catchment. We're also sort of, there's a number of projects that are underway as well. I won't list them all, but for example, as many will be aware, the timber groins and the beach replenishment as part of the Poole Bay Beach Management Scheme along the Poole and Bournemouth frontages. We've got a scheme looking at sort of reducing flood risk between Poole Lifting Bridge and Hunger Hill. We've got a number of maintenance projects underway at Hamworthy Pier, Lake Pier, Hengistbury Head, Christchurch Quay, Mudderford Quay. And one of the big ones at the bottom as well that we're working towards is at Christchurch Bay and Christchurch Harbour. We're putting together a flood risk management strategy for those areas that'll actually look at what future defences are needed to deal with climate change and how those will be funded. And as I've shown there, sort of more information on all of those projects can be found at twobays.net, and that also gives contact details for us. The other ones as well is that we are working quite heavily with the emergency planners, but also with the local resilience forum. So as I said, we've got 2 fully qualified drone pilots, and they've actually been doing some testing of different technologies with the local resilience forum. So actually sort of working in that context as well. So as I say, that's sort of what we're doing as at a local authority level. But I also just wanted to sort of reiterate, I think, some of these points as to what actually you can be doing as members of the public and as individuals. It's really important to check your publicly available mapping, and I've given the link there as to sort of checking your long-term flood risk. We in particular in this area are very fortunate at the moment that the Environment Agency has done a number of bits of mapping and updated them, that actually the data that underlies this is actually now in a very good position. And similarly, we've had a grant from DEFRA that over the last 2 years we've done a lot of work updating our surface water flood risk maps that actually we're quite confident in what a lot of those show. And what I would say is that when they do change, that it's not that your flood risk has changed, it's actually just that our understanding of flood risk and our understanding of how water flows and where it will flow to has improved, rather than the risk itself a lot of the time. So those are sort of there. So I'd really encourage people to log on to check what your flood risk is, and to also be aware as well. I know that Lisa and Guy will push this sort of, there's a service to actually check what flood alerts and flood warnings are in place. In particular, the Avon and the Stour have flood warnings, and the coastal flood risk as well, operated by the Environment Agency to actually sort of check what's in force at the time. And also as well, you can check your local sort of river levels, coastal levels as well. So actually to really be aware of your flood risk and what's going on around you. And what I would then encourage as well, really encourage residents to actually look up sort of what to do before, during and after a flood, to really be aware of what you can do. So actually one of the key parts of that is to put together a flood plan. So you can see there sort of one of the Environment Agency templates on a flood plan and how that looks. but actually sort of a number of key bits on that of actually thinking about who do you contact and how do you contact them? What can you move and where do you move it to? Where are your sort of gas, electric and water main sort of stopcocks and valves and things to actually turn that off during a flood? To make an emergency kit and useful numbers and to have those all to hand. Also as well, put together an emergency flood kit. So think about what do you need and what would you need to hand if there was a flood event? Sort of where are your documents, your electrics, your essentials? For example, do you need anything for your children? Finance, sort of medication or food or water, sort of a number of bits there to have to hand and to put together into an emergency flood kit. And I note this morning there is that emergency flood kit to win by sort of signing up to the Eventbrite for this event as well. And yeah, finally, sort of flood resilience measures as well. There's a number of sort of individual property flood protection measures that can be applied to properties. Like I say, what we quite often find in an urban environment is perhaps there's not always it's not always so possible to look at bigger schemes. Just due to the nature and the site that perhaps it's one property here and one property there and not necessarily a group of properties. And so actually sort of one of the best way forwards is property flood resilience measures. And I've just shown a few pictures there on that sort of bottom right hand side of a front door or an air brick. And a lot of these measures now can actually be quite passive. You don't necessarily, there are sort of options to go and actively install a barrier to stop it, but actually quite a few of them now can be self-sealing doors and self-sealing air bricks. So actually it gives you a bit more peace of mind that, for example, if you're away on a holiday, that actually that will still operate and it will still keep the floodwaters out, so you'll come home sort of to a drier home than you would have done. And we're working sort of at wider schemes that are looking at perhaps what can be done on that property flood resilience measures. We're working, as I say, strategically as a council since we formed as BCP to actually look at perhaps where we can be implementing schemes to protect groups of houses. And we're sort of just in those early stages of those, but would also really encourage sort of individuals to take that ownership of their risk as well and to work with us to actually reduce your own flood risk. So I think that's probably all I have for now. So no, thank you very much for listening, and any questions I'm sure happy to answer.